Hello and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the first 5 sections of the section of Old and New Law Tables in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So let's get started into it. Of Old and New Law Tables, Section 1. Here I sit and wait. Old shattered law tables around me, and also new half-written law tables. When will my hour come? The hour of my down-going, my descent, for I want to go to men once more. For I now wait for first a sign that it is my hour must come to me, namely, the laughing line with a flock of doves. Meanwhile, I talk to myself, as one who has plenty of time. No one tells me anything new, so I tell myself to myself. And so this really sets the tone for this whole section, as we have a discussion with old values and new values, where you have that relation into line and line like nature. In order for us to fight against past values, we need to become lion-like, and therefore do battle against the big dragon, as he says in the section of the 3 metamorphoses. And we have the problem stated straight from the get-go as well, that where are the new values? Where are the new ideas? I'd like to go down amongst men and listen to new things, but ultimately, everybody is attached to these old values and old ideas and stuck amongst their old ways, basically. But I'd like to have some breath of fresh air. I'd like to go down amongst men to have a talk and learn of all these new things. But here I am, ultimately having to keep myself company, because if I go down, I'm not going to have any of that company at all. And really, that's what the whole first section sets us up with. Where are the new values? Where are the new ideas? Section 2. When I visited men, I found them sitting upon an old self-conceit. Each one thought he had long since known what was good and evil for man. All talk of virtue seemed to them an ancient wearied affair, and he who wished to sleep well spoke of good and evil before retiring. I disturbed this somnolence when I taught that nobody yet knows what is good and evil, unless it be the Creator. But he it is who creates a goal for mankind and gives the earth its meaning and its future. He it is who creates the quality of good and evil in things. And I bade them overturn their old professorial chairs, and wherever that old self-conceit had sat, I bade them laugh at their great masters of virtue and saints and poets and world redeemers. I bade them laugh at their gloomy sages, and whoever had sat as a black scarecrow cautioning on the life tree. I sat myself on their great grave street, and even beside carrion and vultures, I laughed over all their past and its decaying, expiring glory. Truly, like Lenten preachers and fools, did I cry anger and shame over all their great and small things. Their best is so very small, their worst is so very small. Thus I laughed. Thus from out of me cried and laughed my wise desire, which was born on the mountains, a wild wisdom and truth, my great desire with rushing wings. And often it tore me forth, and up, and away, and in the midst of laughter. And then indeed I flew, an arrow, quivering with sun-intoxicated rapture, out into the distant future, which no dream has yet seen, into warmer cells than artists had ever dreamed of. There, where gods, dancing, are ashamed of all clothes, so that I might speak in parables, and hobble and stutter like poets, and truly I'm ashamed that I have still to be a poet. Where all becoming seemed to me the dancing of gods, and the wantonness of gods, and the world unrestrained and abandoned and fleeing back to itself, as many gods eternally fleeing and re-seeking one another, as many gods blissfully self-contradicting, communing again and belonging again to one another, where all time seemed to me a blissful mockery of moments, where necessity was freedom itself, which blissfully played with the goad of freedom, where I found again my old devil and arch enemy, the spirit of gravity, and all that he created, compulsion, dogma, need, and consequence, and purpose, and will, and good, and evil. For must there not exist that which is danced upon, danced across? Must there not be moles and heavy dwarfs, for the sake of the nimble, the nimblest? And so in section 2 then we have this relation into ethics and the whole discussion about good and evil. So we have the whole traditional idea within philosophy of good and evil as two pure absolute concepts, and therefore the ethics is going to back up the model into what those ideas are. But Nietzsche says, well, actually, there doesn't exist anything that's purely good, purely evil, because what actually happens is that it's all dependent on somebody who then determines what they think is good and then evil. And of course, that's all then affected by whatever goal, and another way of putting it as well as a posh way is ideology as well. What's the underpinning idea for everyone in their lives to be fit in with a certain approach to life? And an easy example would be to say, well, one approach could be, let's say, we take the whole value that recycling is fantastic for everybody to do, and so then we have to create up an ethics for that. It's good to separate out our rubbish into what's going to be then recycled, so having a separation of your food items, having it then into plastics and tins and so forth, and then putting all those things into the appropriate bins, and then having the whole resources of the garbage man or rubbish man coming along and then picking up your nicely recycled garbage. And so the bad from all that we can see, well, would be simply to do no recycling whatsoever. Why would that be bad? Because what's the whole purpose of recycling is to protect the environment, look after the environment. And so anything that's going to be seen as bad is going to be something that's going to be harmful towards the environment. And so we have that whole point then. It's he who creates the goal, is those people then that underlie the whole morality in which everyone's got to live their everyday lives. And what then that means is that we've got to look at specific people, their psychology, the social constructs at the time, what's going on with it, that given society and culture, what therefore made it emerge during this given time period, what made people be attracted to this certain idea, what made them repulsed by it, why was it either a dormant model or why was it therefore becoming popular another period in time and not there and not in another, and so on, and those type of questions that you can ask. What this does, of course, is then put ethics and morality not into this pure models and ideas, but rather tie them down into very much within historical context that we can analyze and pretty much understand why certain models emerge over others, and trying to therefore understand people's psychology at the same time for why a certain model is created, why are people attracted to this as an idea in this society rather than in another society. And then we have this whole relation into laughing at people who are held up in high regard, as he says. I laugh at them in their gloomy sages. And it's that whole idea there that within a given time period, we can hold up certain people with incredibly high regard and high esteem for their ideas. It could be absolutely groundbreaking at a given time period for whatever they manage to invent or create and so on. But it's always within hindsight, of course. Everybody can look on previous ideas and go, oh my God, how could they thought that was a good idea? How could anybody possibly thought that was a good idea then? And as that's the point, what Nietzsche is trying to say is that whenever we hold something up in high regard to the nth degree like that, it's to say, well, you're failing to take into account precisely the fallibility of ideas in the first place. Ideas are not these pure things that are absolute, but rather very fragile, very much dependent upon whether some people have the taste for them or not. And then if nobody has a taste for a certain idea, it's simply just brushed under the carpet, left to history for our historians to look at and go, oh, people thought that then. Aha, that was a good idea then, wasn't it? Well, it's a good job we don't think about that way now, do we? And that sort of mentality as well is to say, well, that's what ideas are, stuff that's potentially impactful at one given time period, and the absurdity almost and how laughable it is to hold up certain people with such high degrees for what they're talking about now is Nietzsche's almost to say, well, give it 50 years, give it 100 years and so on. People look back on this person, this idea, and they'll think this person was a complete idiot. This then is sort of backed up by the last little bit that rounds off section 2, where he talks about these multiple gods or polytheistic nature of what gods are rather than monotheistic, so multiple gods rather than one god, all sort of dancing around and being self-contradicting. And it's sort of a nice harken back to sort of the Olympic gods and that polytheism, and the way in which they're all self-contradicting because they all go against sort of one another and clash with one another. And it's like one big massive sort of Jerry Springer show. But that's the point that Nietzsche also wants to make, is that ideas of gods or specific religious organizations and so forth are again very temporary things. And sure, they may last thousands of years and so forth, but again it's the whole thing of, well, new gods emerge and new ideas emerge. And that's what was so great about that episode we did, which tied into American gods and Neil Gaiman, and to the way in which Neil Gaiman thought in that book, how do we in a contemporary society still have that religious relation back into worshipping things. And then Neil Gaiman talks about how we now worship these new forms of gods that are like media and the internet and the economy and so forth. So rather than having these all-powerful gods, the gods themselves sort of just change into different things. And that's what Nietzsche is also thinking about here as well. That's how it works. So we just can't get rid of these sort of mentalities that we have from the past. These are sort of left over in a way and continue on, and we sort of worship new gods, albeit in a completely different way to how we did it in the past. And then what's nice is that line that rounds it off as well. We need these things to be there in the first place, really is the argument as it rounds off, to say that for must there not exist that which is danced upon, danced across. So it's to say, well, we can't precisely arrive at new ideas unless we have the old ones to go across and move across and challenge in the first place. There's no progress unless we have something to challenge. So it's against the idea of some sort of pure anarchy or some sort of form of system where you just try to push everything completely aside. Rather, it's here, well, we need the stuff to dance with. We need a good dancing partner, basically. And the old things give us the good dancing partner, but its legs is going to fall out from under it at some point, and it's us that's going to have to try and hold it up. But eventually, you're going to say, well, I need to go across and get myself a new partner, but here I am stuck with this thing that I have to try and work with. And that's the whole point that Nietzsche's like, well, you have to try and work with this thing. You better do, because you're going to need it in order to get to where you need to get to in the first place, which is all the new stuff. Section 3. There it was too that I picked up the word Superman, and that man is something that must be overcome. That man is a bridge and not a goal, counting himself happy for his noontides and evenings is a way to new dawns. Zarathustra's sayings of the great noontide and whatever else I have hung up over men like a purple evening afterglow. Truly, I showed them new stars together with new nights, and over cloud and day and night I spread out laughter like a coloured canopy. I taught them all my art and aims, to compose into one and to bring together what is fragment and riddle and dreadful chance in man. As poet, reader of riddles, and redeemer of chance, I taught them to create the future and to redeem by creating all that was past. To redeem that past of mankind and to transform every it was, until the will says, but I willed it thus, so shall I will it. This did I call redemption, this alone did I teach them to call redemption. Now I wait my redemption, that I may go to them for the last time. For I want to go to man once more, I want to go under among men, I want to give them, dying, my richest gift. From the sun, when it goes down, the superabundant star, I learned this. Then, from inexhaustible riches, it pours out gold into the sea, so that the poorest fisherman rows with golden oars. For, once I saw this, I did not tire of weeping to see it. Like the sun, Zarathustra also wants to go down. Now he sits here and waits, old shattered law tables around him, and also new law tables, half written. So there where I found the Superman. So we have that whole relation into what does man mean is something that's weak and must be overcome, and what's going to overcome man is a Superman. Why is man weak? Because man is something that's ultimately herd-like and has herd mentality, doesn't have any creativity. The creativity is all sapped out of them. And so what's one aspect of the whole idea of the Superman is to be affirmative of your own creative will and creative ideas, to have your own ideas in the first place, to therefore be critical and have a critical approach and analysis towards other people. That therefore allows us to start to form an opinion for ourselves and belief for ourselves. And the Superman is the one that can say, I willed it thus, because it has all that form of self-confidence. And it's that whole movement that Nietzsche says in the previous section, where we want to all sort of strive towards that whole idea of self-improvement. And it's not an easy way to do it either. It's not suddenly you just wake up a day and say, now I believe everything that makes me up and that's who I am. We don't get there easily whatsoever. It's a whole uphill battle to find out who we are. And who we are, therefore, is going to be built into something much greater than what we were in the past, as he says. So this whole movement from past to future, therefore, allows us just to become super people, in inverted commas, if you want to put it that way, because we're in that sense of continually trying to improve ourselves, be critical of our own ideas as well at the same time, and therefore just continually work at ourselves like a sculpture, basically chipping away. So it's interesting here as well. We have three important things that are picked up on is fragment, riddle, and dreadful chance. Fragment. So we have this whole idea of Nietzsche's famous aphorisms as well, and they themselves as being fragments. And so we also have then the idea of the pre-Socratics, people who wrote before Socrates are all bundled into that group, and those ideas all are called fragments as well. What then that whole idea as well is it doesn't have a whole, because you got to try and piece it together as best as you can, and it doesn't quite fit with another piece. Basically, there's no such thing as a perfect jigsaw, and there's going to be bits and bobs that's all going to be missing. And so isn't it interesting then we have this whole idea saying, well, actually there's no perfect whole. In fact, man is, or humanity is, rather like this idea of a broken vase, like in archaeology, that we've found, but we can't quite find all the pieces. We have a piece here, we have a piece there, and the lovely person is trying to fit as best together as they can, but that's what makes us up. We don't have an absolutely perfect history to it all. Nothing is absolutely perfect. What is this exactly going up against? Hard is, of course, traditional philosophy and that idea of a pure metaphysics and metaphysical idea for who we are. Why is that the case? Because metaphysics is always in the argument of always trying to make things pure, therefore eternal, everlasting, and all that stuff. Why is that the case? Because if you got all that as a basis, therefore you have absolute certainty. If you have that certainty, you have knowledge, you have an idea of who you are, and so on. Nietzsche's like rubbish, complete crap. There's no such thing that guarantees who the hell we are other than these fragments, these scattered fragments that ultimately make us up. We don't have this complete picture. We are pretty much like this broken vase. Then we have this idea of a riddle. So, of course, we can have fun examples like immediately comes to mind Riddler and Batman, riddle me this, Batman. But when again we have this sense of riddles, then we have that whole relation into critical thinking, and as well as the whole mystical element about humanity as well at the same time, that then goes into, well, do we have complete knowledge about absolutely everything? What about the mysteries? What about the riddles? Isn't those sort of things really interesting in the first place? Because those are sort of things that drive us to want to know, and those are the challenges as well to knowledge at the same time. All those gaps, that's precisely in that big archaeological vase. People want to go and fill it. People want basically that perfect vase. You're not going to get it. But how important are those little missing pieces that we want to therefore go and try and strive to understand in the first place? It's all very positive stuff. Then we have chance and the whole idea of novelty. And traditionally within philosophy, again, the whole idea of novelty and chance is very much wiped out completely. Why? Because if you have anything variable, variable means ideas can't be concrete, and truth therefore can't be concrete, and everything completely falls apart. Because traditionally within philosophy, again, it likes to work within the realms of metaphysics to make everything stable. Knowledge is stable, truth is stable, and so on. Nietzsche's more like along the lines of, well, nothing is really quite stable. It's all sort of like a house of cards in a situation, and pretty much it could all just collapse down at any given point. It's all pretty much left up to chance. And it's really interesting when you get into the whole history of ideas side of things as well, because you could think about specifically civilizations and their ideas, and how much all that's left precisely to chance, that somebody manages to stumble upon it in an archaeological dig or find out about that specific civilization. How much civilizations do we know? Only a handful compared to the possibility of all those that didn't exist. How come we only know what we know solely through chance? Section 4. Behold, here is a new law table, but where are my brothers to hear it with me to the valley and to fleshy hearts? Thus commands my great love for the most distant men. Do not spare your neighbor. Man is something that must be overcome. There are diverse paths and ways to overcoming. Just look to it. But only a buffoon thinks man can also be jumped over. Overcome yourself, even in your neighbor, and a right that you seize for yourself you should not accept as a gift. What you do, no one can do to you. Behold, there is no requital. He who cannot command himself should obey, and many a one can command himself, but be very remiss in obeying what he commands. Section 5. This is the will of those of noble soul. They desire nothing gratis, least of all life. He who is of the mob wants to grant life gratis. We others, however, to whom life has given itself, we are always considering what we can best give in return. And truly, it is a noble speech that says, what life has promised us, we shall keep that promise to life. One should not wish to enjoy where one has not given enjoyment, and one should not wish to enjoy. For enjoyment and innocence are the most modest things. Neither want to be looked for. One should have them, but one should look rather for guilt and pain. So with section 4 then, we have this whole relation into most distant men, as he says, so men of the future. Don't let people basically define you, is one of the main things that comes out of the line. Thus commands my great love for the most distant men. Don't spare your neighbor. Man is something that must be overcome. Again, repeating this whole idea of overcoming and overcoming ideas, but what in this given instance has the neighbor has as an idea is that of you and who you are as a specific person. And we can have that when we think of partners or friends and so forth, all having a very specific image of us, and we ourselves sort of fitting in and conforming to their expectations. And what Nietzsche says here is, well, don't spare your neighbor, is ultimately don't fit in within those expectations. Rather challenge the model or the norm that people have set up for you, not in a horrible way, of course, not to just be a complete butthead about it, but to say, well, oh, I didn't realize that you could do this, or wow, your just attitude today really impressed me, I didn't expect that, and so on. Just suddenly being like, well, your idea of me doesn't actually fit into what you held up as your idea of what I am as a person, because that's always the problem as well. But we always seem to categorize and generalize people into fitting in within stereotypes and so on. And we see that within actors as well, getting typecast as they do. But as we are as people, we in our way are sort of typecast into various different roles, but it's always wanting to go outside that expectations that other people have and say, well, haha, you can't actually typecast me because I don't quite fit within this given model. And what's important here as well is this whole idea of overcoming and overcoming past ideas. He says there's a diverse path. So here we're going against the grain again of traditional philosophy, where you'd have specifically one person creating the model on which everybody else should live their life by. But Nietzsche says here, no, diversity is the answer. There's many different ways of tackling how do we get to a new way of thinking about things or a new approach. It's never just the way. It's specifically my ways, he says in the past, and there's lots of different ways. Only a buffoon then thinks you could just make that straight leap. So it's that whole point again that only a complete idiot would think the leap from an old idea into a new idea is something that's immediate and something that's going to be done easily or fast, as well as it's that whole painful, arduous journey and constant striving to get there in the first place. And it's that whole point as well that then goes into the last bit for section 4. Either there's people who can command and obey, as he says, and those people who are ultimately sure of themselves, sure of their beliefs and opinions, will be those who are commanders. People who are not so sure of their opinions and belief will be those who obey. Why? Because when you don't have any specific ideas or opinions for yourself, you'll latch on to those people that do have a very strong opinion and belief about things. And so it goes into that whole command-obey relationship. And as he says, there's a slight irony, is that, of course, he who cannot command himself should obey, and many a one can command himself, but be very remiss in obeying what he commands. So it's almost gone into our psychological makeup in a way there to say, well, yes, we can be very sure of who we are, our beliefs and our opinions, but even then we're quite lazy about things, and we just fall back into this whole obeying aspect. Even we can be fantastic intellectuals, fantastic opinions, but it's like we have that whole remiss, as he says. We're very negligent about ourselves. And so it goes back into that whole idea that, again, that Nietzsche wants us to think of here, is that's that idea of a care for ourselves, and not to be negligent of you and your own ideas and your own opinions, because as soon as you let that slip, as soon as you become negligent, then you just go into the old relapse and just to therefore straight obey somebody else again. And of course, that is the problem. It's so much easier for somebody else to do the thinking for us. It's so much easier for us to obey what somebody else says rather than do all the hard work for ourselves. And that's the whole sort of psychological point that's being made here, is that we've got to do all the hard work for ourselves and do it in a way that we're going to be kicking and screaming and pushing ourselves really to the point of potentially discomfort at times, because, well, you don't want to end up in that position where you're just going to straight obey. And you're going to want to understand why there's a specific problem within another idea and so on. And then this is a nice relation into section 5, because he says, well, this attitude is those of the noble soul, as he says. They desire nothing gratis, so they desire nothing free of charge. They have to strive and work for it. Why is that the case? Because you get something out of it in a much grander way, of course, if you've had to work for it, rather than all just handed to you. And of course, a great example that usually comes up for this would be the appreciation of money and how to spend money as well. And as if everybody is just given something to them through a gift, then there's really no appreciation of how much that thing costs and so on. But if they've had to work for it themselves, then they've had to see how much man hours and how much labor has had to be accumulated up in order for them to afford the gift in the first place for the other person. And that's where we get back into the psychological makeup again of everybody, as he says, because this is what the mob wants. It's that they want everything for free, and they don't want to work hard for anything. As we go into the whole idea again of herd mentality, having a nice sort of life as we do in the herd, everything's already provided for us. All we have to do is just relax, just chew on some grass and masticate away. But that's not what we want, because then it goes into the line that sort of rounds off section 5. And it's a strange one as well. Initially reading it, you think, what are you on, Nietzsche, here? Saying that you have to go out and look for guilt and pain. Isn't everybody already good enough for looking for guilt and pain? Don't we all feel miserable enough as it is without you telling us to go and look for it? I don't have to go look for it. I could find it plentiful in abundance here, there, and everywhere. I just have a nice old scoop of guilt and pain wherever I look. But of course, Nietzsche's not just outright saying that enjoyment of life is not something that we should have at all. Rather, it goes back into this whole argument to do with appreciation and into his famous aphorism, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So it's that whole idea of life's hardships molding us into having a much deeper appreciation of life itself, and also develops us and toughens us up as individuals. And what do we get out of all that is, of course, us as a much more well-formed individual because of all that. And what would we not want, of course, is just to want a nice, pleasant, happy life where none of that happens, or try to pretend that none of that happens, because then you're living in a complete idealistic state. And that's not what we want, of course. And it's criticizing, in a way, the way in which philosophy kind of works within this sort of idealistic state where there is no hardships if only you followed a certain ethical model. Life should be peachy, but that's the point that Nietzsche wants to make, is even if there is an ethical model, nothing about that model is going to stop life's hardships from occurring. And even if the person is the best ethical person alive, let's say Superman, literally the DC comic version, let's say if they're literally an absolutely fantastic saintly individual, even that wouldn't stop life's hardships from occurring. Does that mean life is horrible at times? Yes, but we ultimately can say from all that, life is a very beneficial thing and its hardships, because it enables us to be stronger individuals at the end of it, and having gone through all those hardships in the first place. So that about wraps it up for the discussion of the first 5 sections of Old and New Law Tables, and in the subsequent episodes we'll be continuing on working our way through this section. Many thanks for listening to the episode. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Also, feel free to drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.